Marcus Sullivan stood at the edge of the world, watching the Atlantic Ocean crash against the jagged rocks 200 feet below. The lighthouse behind him creaked in the salt wind, its red brick exterior weathered by decades of coastal storms. He'd inherited this place from his great-uncle Edmund, a man he'd met only once at a family reunion when Marcus was 12. Now, at 28, he found himself the unlikely owner of Beacon Point Lighthouse and its surrounding 15 acres of rocky coastland. The lawyer had been apologetic about the inheritance. "Not much monetary value, I'm afraid," she'd said, sliding the deed across her mahogany desk. The lighthouse was decommissioned in 1987. The Coast Guard maintains an automated beacon now, but the old structure is yours. Your uncle's will specifically mentions that you should maintain the watch and never let the door remain unchained for long. Marcus had assumed the old man was referring to security. The lighthouse was isolated, accessible only by a winding dirt road that branched off the coastal highway. Break-ins weren't uncommon in abandoned properties, but as he explored his inheritance over the past 3 days, he'd found something that made Uncle Edmund's cryptic instructions take on a more ominous tone. The lighthouse was 3 stories tall, with a circular staircase winding up to the lamp room. The ground floor had been converted into a modest living space sometime in the 1960s, complete with a kitchenette, a sitting area with a stone fireplace, and a small bedroom. The second floor housed what appeared to be a study, filled with maritime charts, journals dating back decades, and shelves lined with books about oceanography, astronomy, and subjects Marcus couldn't quite categorize. But it was the basement that troubled him. He'd discovered the entrance on his second day, hidden behind a bookshelf that swung outward on well-oiled hinges. A narrow stone staircase descended into darkness, leading to a chamber carved directly from the bedrock beneath the lighthouse. The room was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with walls that showed tool marks from its original excavation. At the center stood a heavy wooden door set flush into the floor, secured by thick iron chains that looked far newer than the door itself. The chains were fastened with a modern padlock, and Marcus had found the key hanging on a hook near the basement entrance, along with a handwritten note in Uncle Edmund's spidery script. "Replace the lock every 5 years. Oil the chains monthly. Never open the door after sunset. If something knocks from below, do not answer." Marcus had laughed when he first read it. Uncle Edmund had always been known for his eccentricities, and this seemed like an elaborate joke or perhaps the ravings of an old man losing his grip on reality. The basement door was probably just access to some old storage space or maybe a root cellar from the lighthouse's early days. But the door bothered him. It was ancient, made from planks of dark wood bound with iron studs that had oxidized to a rusty brown. The wood itself seemed almost black with age, and when Marcus placed his hand against it, the surface felt unnaturally cold. More disturbing were the deep scratches gouged into the wood from underneath, as if something with very large claws had been trying to claw its way out. On his 3rd night, Marcus decided to test his uncle's warnings. He'd been a software engineer before inheriting the lighthouse, a man who believed in logic and evidence. Ghost stories and family superstitions meant nothing to him. After dinner, he descended to the basement with a flashlight and approached the chained door. He knelt beside it and knocked once, firmly against the dark wood. The sound echoed strangely in the circular chamber, seeming to travel farther than it should. Marcus waited, feeling slightly foolish, but nothing happened. He was about to leave when he noticed something odd about the echo. It had sounded wrong somehow, as if the space beneath the door was much larger than it should be. The lighthouse was built on solid rock, and according to the construction records he'd found upstairs, the foundation extended only a few feet into the bedrock. Shrugging off his unease, Marcus returned to the main floor and tried to focus on cataloging his uncle's possessions. He'd found several journals filled with observations about tides, weather patterns, and astronomical events. Uncle Edmund had been meticulous in his record-keeping, noting everything from the phases of the moon to the migration patterns of local seabirds. Some entries were harder to interpret, filled with references to the deep signals and threshold maintenance. As midnight approached, Marcus settled into the sitting room with a cup of coffee and one of his uncle's journals. The wind had picked up outside, and the lighthouse structure groaned and shifted in the gusts. He'd grown accustomed to these sounds over the past few days, but tonight, something seemed different. Beneath the familiar creaking and the crash of waves, he heard something else. It started as a low vibration, felt more than heard, coming from somewhere deep beneath the lighthouse. Marcus set down his coffee and listened intently. The vibration grew stronger, becoming an actual sound, a deep rumbling that seemed to emanate from the bedrock itself. Then, cutting through the rumble, came something that made his blood freeze. A scream. It rose from the depths below, muffled by stone and earth, but unmistakably the sound of something in agony or rage. The scream went on for nearly 30 seconds, climbing in pitch and intensity until it became almost inaudible, then cutting off abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, coffee forgotten as his rational mind tried to process what he'd heard. Gas escaping through rock fissures could make strange sounds. Shifting geological formations sometimes produced unusual acoustics. But what he'd heard hadn't sounded geological. It had sounded alive, and intelligent, and very, very angry. The lighthouse fell silent again except for the wind and waves. Marcus remained in his chair until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to investigate, and most of all afraid that if he knocked on that door again, something might knock back. Dawn brought no relief to Marcus's frayed nerves. He'd spent the night dozing fitfully in the chair, jerking awake at every sound the old lighthouse made. When gray morning light finally filtered through the salt-stained windows, he forced himself to move, to make coffee, to pretend the night had been normal. But it hadn't been normal, and as he stood in the kitchen waiting for the coffee to brew, he found himself staring at the basement door. In daylight, his uncle's warning seemed less like superstition and more like hard-earned wisdom. Something was down there beneath the chained door, something that didn't want to be confined. Marcus pulled out his laptop and began researching the history of Beacon Point. The lighthouse had been built in 1847 to guide ships away from the treacherous rocks that jutted up from the ocean floor like broken teeth. The location had been chosen specifically because it offered a clear view in all directions and sat on solid bedrock that could support the structure's weight. But the more he dug into local records, the more disturbing details emerged. Ships had been disappearing near Beacon Point long before the lighthouse was built. Native American tribes in the area had considered the headland cursed, referring to it in their oral histories as the place where the deep ones sing. Early colonial records mentioned strange lights in the water and fishermen who returned from the area speaking of voices calling to them from beneath the waves. The lighthouse construction itself had been troubled. 3 workers had died during the excavation of the foundation, and 2 more had simply vanished. The project supervisor's journal, preserved in the County Historical Society's archives, made for unsettling reading. Workers had complained of sounds coming from beneath the bedrock, of nightmares that plagued everyone on the construction crew, of a growing sense that they were being watched from below. Most telling was an entry dated October 13, 1847. Found the chamber today while digging foundation. Natural cave perfectly round with passages leading deeper into the rock. Foreman wants to seal it up and pretend it was never there. Workers refuse to go near it after sunset. Strange markings on the walls, symbols that hurt to look at. Something moves in the deeper passages, something that shouldn't be there. We'll cement over the opening and build the lighthouse above it. May God forgive us for what we're trapping down there. Marcus leaned back from his laptop, pieces falling into place. His uncle hadn't been guarding an empty basement. He'd been maintaining a prison. A search through Uncle Edmund's study revealed more disturbing information. Hidden in a locked drawer that Marcus had pried open with a screwdriver, he found a collection of documents that painted a picture of a family obligation spanning generations. Letters dated back to the 1890s detailed a compact made between the lighthouse keepers and something that lived in the depths below Beacon Point. The arrangement was simple and terrible. The entity would remain confined as long as certain conditions were met. The door must never be opened. The chains must be maintained, and most importantly, someone from the bloodline must always be present to reinforce the binding. The lighthouse had been passed down through Marcus's family not because of its monetary value, but because they were bound to it by something far older than property law. Uncle Edmund's final journal entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand, revealed the weight of this responsibility. I can feel it getting stronger, he'd written just a month before his death. The binding weakens with age and I don't have much time left. Marcus is the only one of the bloodline young enough to take over, but he doesn't know what he'll be inheriting. How do you explain to someone that their family has been jailers for over a century? The journal went on to describe increasingly frequent manifestations, things moving in the basement that weren't there when Edmund investigated, sounds of scraping and clawing coming from beneath the door, dreams of vast underwater cities and beings that had ruled the oceans long before humans existed. Most disturbing were Edmund's accounts of the entity's attempts at communication, patterns of knocks and vibrations that seemed almost linguistic. Marcus was so absorbed in reading that he didn't notice the sun beginning to set until shadows started creeping across the study floor. Panic seized him as he remembered Uncle Edmund's most emphatic warning: never open the door after sunset. But he hadn't opened it. He'd only knocked once, and that had been the previous night. As if summoned by his thoughts, the vibrations began again. This time they were stronger, more insistent. The entire lighthouse seemed to shudder with each pulse, and Marcus could hear the chains in the basement rattling against the floor door. He grabbed Uncle Edmund's journal and raced downstairs to the basement, his flashlight beam dancing wildly as he descended. The chains were indeed rattling, not from any external force but from movement beneath the door. Something was pushing against it from below, and the ancient wood was beginning to flex under the pressure. The padlock held firm, but Marcus could see stress cracks forming in the door itself. Then the knocking began. 3 slow, deliberate strikes against the underside of the door, followed by a pause, then 3 more. It was a rhythm, a pattern, and Marcus realized with growing horror that it was mimicking his own knock from the night before. The entity wasn't just aware of his presence, it was trying to communicate. The knocking changed, becoming more complex. Long sequences of strikes and pauses that reminded Marcus of Morse code. He found himself listening intently, trying to decode the pattern, when Uncle Edmund's journal fell open in his hands to a page he hadn't seen before. Never try to understand what it's saying. Edmund had written in red ink, as if the warning was of utmost importance. The moment you begin to comprehend its language, it begins to comprehend you. The binding works both ways. It keeps the entity contained, but it also keeps us human. Communication is the first step toward transformation. Marcus slammed the journal shut and backed away from the door, but the damage was already done. The knocking pattern was burned into his memory, and even as he climbed the basement stairs, he could feel his mind trying to parse it, to find meaning in the rhythm. Part of him wanted to go back, to listen more carefully, to try to understand what the entity was trying to tell him. That impulse terrified him more than anything else. In the lighthouse's main room, Marcus barricaded the basement door with furniture and tried to focus on practical matters. He needed to contact someone, but who would believe his story? The local police would think he was having a breakdown. Scientists would want to investigate, potentially making everything worse. As the night deepened, the sounds from below grew louder and more varied. Along with the knocking, he began to hear what sounded like voices, multiple entities speaking in harmonious patterns that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his bones. The lighthouse itself became an instrument, vibrating with frequencies that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. And through it all, Marcus found himself beginning to understand. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. As his hand pressed against the warm wood of the door, the collective's memories flooded through him in a torrent of images and sensations that spanned geological ages. He saw Earth as it had been 65 million years ago, when their cities had stretched across the ocean floors in vast networks of living architecture. He felt the terror and confusion when the great extinction event had torn holes in reality itself, creating dimensional rifts that swallowed entire civilizations. But most disturbing was what he learned about humanity's true origins. The collective had been watching. When the first proto-humans had descended from the trees, they had observed the development of language, of tool use, of the spark of consciousness that distinguished humans from other animals. And they had been afraid. Human minds were different from anything that had existed before. Where other creatures thought in patterns of instinct and immediate need, humans thought in abstractions and possibilities, in concepts that could reshape reality through sheer force of imagination. The collective had recognized this new form of consciousness as a threat to their own existence, a pattern of thought so alien to their own that contact between the two could be mutually destructive. The binding ritual beneath Beacon Point hadn't been created by the lighthouse keepers at all. It had been designed by the collective themselves, a desperate attempt to prevent the two forms of consciousness from merging catastrophically. They had allowed themselves to be imprisoned, not because humans had overpowered them, but because they had foreseen what would happen if their ancient minds touched the chaotic creativity of human thought. Both species would be transformed beyond recognition. Marcus jerked his hand away from the door, but it was too late. The connection had been established, and now he could feel the collective's presence growing stronger in his mind. His thoughts were becoming less linear, more associative, taking on the deep harmonic patterns that characterized their form of consciousness. At the same time, he could sense the entities below beginning to experience human emotions for the first time. Brief, intense flashes of joy and fear and desire that were utterly foreign to their ancient existence. The transformation was already beginning, and Marcus realized with growing horror that he was patient zero in a process that could ultimately reshape both species. Every moment of contact made the change more pronounced, more irreversible. His human consciousness was providing a bridge between two incompatible forms of thought, and that bridge was rapidly becoming a permanent highway. He stumbled upstairs, trying to clear his head, but the voices of the collective followed him. They were no longer separate entities speaking in harmony. They were becoming part of his own thought process, their ancient knowledge integrating with his human creativity in ways that generated entirely new insights. Marcus found himself understanding principles of dimensional physics that no human had ever conceived, while simultaneously experiencing the strange beauty of mortal emotion that the collective had never known. The lighthouse around him began to change as well. The electric lights flickered and dimmed, replaced by a soft phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The metal fixtures grew warm and began to reshape themselves into more organic forms, as if the building was becoming a hybrid of human technology and collective bioarchitecture. Marcus tried to fight the transformation, but found that he no longer wanted to. The merging of consciousnesses was producing insights of breathtaking beauty and complexity. He could see how to solve problems that had plagued humanity for centuries, how to generate limitless clean energy, how to communicate faster than light, how to reshape matter at the molecular level. The knowledge was intoxicating, and he found himself eager to experience more. But a small part of his mind, the part that was still purely human, recognized the trap. This was how the collective had survived for millions of years, by absorbing and integrating other forms of consciousness when they encountered them. They didn't conquer species. They transformed them, turning potential threats into extensions of their own collective will. The process felt like enlightenment from the inside, but viewed objectively it was a form of elaborate predation. Marcus forced himself to focus on Uncle Edmund's warnings, using them as an anchor to his human identity. The lighthouse keepers hadn't been maintaining a prison. They had been preventing an assimilation that would have begun the moment human minds came into contact with the collective. Each generation had sacrificed their mental purity to maintain the barrier, allowing themselves to be partially transformed while preventing the process from spreading to the rest of humanity. The realization gave Marcus an idea. If the transformation was already inevitable for him, then perhaps he could use it strategically. Instead of fighting the change or trying to reverse it, he could guide it, shaping the merger in ways that would benefit humanity, rather than simply serving the collective's agenda. He began to experiment with the connection, pushing his own thoughts and values into the link, while carefully monitoring how they affected the entities below. The collective was fascinated by human concepts like individual identity and personal growth, ideas that had no equivalent in their ancient group consciousness. Marcus fed them stories of human achievement, of scientific discoveries, of artistic creations that had emerged from the chaos of individual human minds. The entities absorbed these concepts hungrily, but as they did, Marcus could feel them changing. Their unified consciousness began to develop fractures, individual voices emerging from the collective harmony. For the first time in millions of years, members of the collective began to think of themselves as separate beings, with distinct perspectives and desires. The process was traumatic for them. These ancient minds had never experienced isolation, had never been forced to confront existence as individual entities. They reached out desperately to each other, trying to reestablish their unity, but the human concepts Marcus had shared with them made true collective consciousness impossible. They were becoming individuals, and the experience was both terrifying and exhilarating. But the transformation was working both ways. As the collective fragmented into individual entities, Marcus found his own consciousness expanding to accommodate multiple perspectives simultaneously. He could think in parallel tracks, considering dozens of possibilities at once while maintaining awareness of each separate line of reasoning. His perception of time became more fluid, allowing him to experience past and future as coexisting realities rather than sequential events. The lighthouse itself reflected these changes, its structure becoming increasingly organic and multidimensional. Rooms appeared where none had existed before, connected by passages that folded space in impossible ways. The beacon at the top began to emit light in spectra that human eyes had never been designed to see, creating patterns that served as communication devices for consciousness, operating on multiple dimensional levels. Marcus realized that he was becoming something new, something that had never existed before, a hybrid consciousness that combined human creativity with the collective's ancient wisdom. He was no longer entirely human, but neither was he becoming one of them. Instead, he was pioneering a third path, a form of consciousness that could bridge the gap between the two species without destroying either one. But the process was not without cost. Each moment of transformation took him further from his original humanity, and Marcus could feel essential parts of himself dissolving into the larger pattern. His memories of his former life were becoming abstract, like stories he had heard about someone else. His emotional connections to other humans were fading, replaced by a more universal form of empathy that extended to all forms of consciousness. As the night deepened, Marcus made a decision that would determine the fate of both species. Instead of trying to maintain the binding or release the collective entirely, he would offer himself as a permanent bridge between the two forms of consciousness. He would become the guardian not just of Beacon Point, but of the delicate balance between human and collective awareness. The transformation would make him something more than human, but less than a god, a conscious interface between realities that could facilitate communication without allowing destructive merger. It was a sacrifice that would save both species, but at the cost of his own individual existence. Marcus began to prepare for the final stage of his metamorphosis. Marcus woke on the lighthouse floor with blood trickling from his nose and the taste of copper in his mouth. Sunlight streamed through the windows and the sounds from below had ceased. His head throbbed with a pain unlike anything he'd ever experienced, as if someone had been rearranging his thoughts while he slept. But worse than the pain was the knowledge that now filled his mind. During the night, while the entities below had sung their harmonic patterns, Marcus had begun to understand their language, not intellectually, but at a deeper level, as if the sounds were unlocking portions of his brain that had never been active before. He knew things now that he shouldn't know, things about the true nature of the ocean and what lay beneath its deepest trenches. The beings trapped below Beacon Point were refugees, survivors of a civilization that had thrived in Earth's oceans, millions of years before the first humans had walked upright. They called themselves the Abyssal Collective, and they had once commanded vast cities of living coral and metal that spanned the ocean floors. But something had driven them deep, forcing them to hide in the spaces between dimensions, in pockets of reality that existed parallel to but separate from the human world. The chamber beneath the lighthouse was one of their last footholds in the physical realm, a place where the barriers between dimensions were thin enough for them to maintain a presence. They had been trying to return to their ocean home for centuries, but the binding placed on them by lighthouse keepers had trapped them in their dimensional pocket, unable to fully manifest in the physical world. Marcus understood all of this with perfect clarity, and that understanding terrified him. Uncle Edmund's warning echoed in his mind. Communication was the first step toward transformation. By learning their language, Marcus had opened a channel between himself and the collective, and that channel worked both ways. He could feel them in his thoughts now, ancient minds that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless species. They were curious about him, these strange beings who lived in the thin layer between ocean and sky. They wanted to understand human consciousness, to experience the brief, bright flicker of mortal awareness, and they were hungry. Marcus staggered to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face, trying to clear his head. In the mirror, his reflection looked pale and drawn, and his eyes seemed different somehow, as if they were focusing on things that weren't quite there. When he blinked, he caught glimpses of the vast underwater cities the collective had shown him, coral spires reaching toward the surface like grasping fingers. He needed help, but Uncle Edmund's journals had made it clear that this was a burden carried alone. The lighthouse keepers had maintained their watch in isolation, bound by blood and duty to contain something that most of humanity couldn't comprehend. Each generation had passed down the responsibility along with warnings about the cost of that knowledge. But Marcus was an engineer, not a mystic. He approached problems with logic and systematic thinking. If the binding was weakening, then maybe it could be strengthened. If the entities were trapped between dimensions, then perhaps the trap could be reinforced using principles of science rather than superstition. He spent the morning examining the basement chamber more carefully, mapping its dimensions and studying the construction. The room had been carved from solid bedrock with tools that left smooth, precise surfaces. The floor door was positioned at the exact center of the chamber, and Marcus noticed that the stone around it had been inlaid with metal strips arranged in complex geometric patterns. The patterns hurt to look at directly, creating optical illusions that made his eyes water and his head spin. But when he photographed them with his phone and examined the images, he could see that they formed a kind of circuit, a conducting path that connected the door to metal contacts set into the walls. The entire chamber was designed as some kind of containment apparatus, using principles that blended ancient knowledge with early electrical theory. Uncle Edmund's technical notes, hidden in a separate journal, revealed that the lighthouse keepers had been more than simple guardians. They had been maintaining what was essentially a dimensional anchor, using electromagnetic fields generated by the lighthouse itself to reinforce the barriers between realities. The beacon that had once guided ships to safety was also serving as a prison gate, its light powered by the same forces that kept the collective contained. But the system was failing. The metal strips in the floor had corroded over the decades, and the electromagnetic field they generated was weakening. The collective was pressing against the barriers with increasing force, and it was only a matter of time before they broke through entirely. Marcus found himself in an impossible situation. He could try to maintain the existing system, accepting his role as jailer and hoping the containment held for another generation. Or he could attempt to strengthen it using modern technology, risking unknown consequences if he made a mistake. The third option, releasing the collective entirely, wasn't really an option at all. Uncle Edmund's journals made clear what would happen if beings of such power gained unrestricted access to the physical world. As he pondered his choices, Marcus began to hear the voices again, even though it was still daylight. The collective was growing stronger, their influence reaching him even through the reinforced barriers. They spoke of the loneliness of their exile, of the beauty of their lost cities, of the knowledge they could share if only he would remove the chains. But they also spoke of hunger, of the need to feed on the electrical patterns of living minds, of their desire to transform the oceans back into the realm they had once ruled. They showed him visions of Earth as it could be, a water world where their coral cities stretched from surface to seafloor, where the brief spark of human civilization had been absorbed and metabolized into something grander and more enduring. Marcus realized that the collective wasn't evil, exactly. They were simply operating according to an alien logic that had no place for human values or human survival. To them, the transformation of Earth's oceans would be an act of restoration, returning the planet to its natural state. The fact that this would mean the extinction of humanity was merely an unfortunate side effect. By evening, the voices had become constant companions. Marcus could barely distinguish his own thoughts from their whispered suggestions. They urged him to examine the door more closely, to study the chains that bound them, to understand the full mechanism of their imprisonment. Knowledge was power, they insisted, and only by understanding could he hope to make the right choice. Against his better judgment, Marcus found himself descending to the basement once again. The chamber felt different now, charged with potential energy that made his skin tingle. The metal strips in the floor were glowing faintly, and he could see complex patterns of light moving through them like water through transparent pipes. The door itself seemed more substantial than before, as if the collective's growing presence was making it more real. The scratches on its surface had deepened, and new marks appeared even as Marcus watched. Something with multiple claws was working at the wood from below, patient and methodical in its effort to weaken the barrier. Marcus knelt beside the door and placed his hand against its surface. The wood was warm now, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. Through the connection, he could feel the vast intelligence of the collective pressing against the dimensional barrier, ancient minds that had once commanded the forces of the deep ocean, and in that moment of contact, Marcus understood the terrible truth that had driven his ancestors to maintain their lonely vigil. The choice wasn't really between freedom and imprisonment for the collective. It was between the survival of humanity and the return of Earth's original rulers. The war between land and sea had been going on for millions of years, and Marcus Sullivan had just become its newest battlefield. The transformation reached its crescendo as dawn broke over Beacon Point. Marcus felt his consciousness expand beyond the confines of his physical form, spreading through the lighthouse structure and into the dimensional networks that connected to the collective's realm. He was no longer a single point of awareness, but rather a distributed intelligence that existed simultaneously in multiple realities. Through his new perceptions, Marcus could observe the completion of the collective's fragmentation. What had once been a unified consciousness spanning millions of years had become dozens of individual entities, each struggling to understand their newfound autonomy. Some, like Resonance, embraced their individuality and sought to learn from human experience. Others retreated into isolation, overwhelmed by the concept of separate existence. A few maintained their hostility toward humanity, viewing the fragmentation as a form of contamination that needed to be reversed. But Marcus's role as an interface allowed him to moderate these conflicts. He could facilitate communication between the different factions, while preventing any single group from gaining enough coherence to break through the dimensional barriers. More importantly, he could serve as a translator between human and collective consciousness, making it possible for selected individuals from both species to communicate without the destructive merger that had always been the risk. The first test of this new system came when Resonance requested direct contact with human consciousness. The entity had absorbed enough of Marcus's memories to understand the concept of scientific research, and it wanted to collaborate with human scientists on projects that could benefit both species. But direct mental contact between Resonance and an unprotected human mind would result in the same transformation that Marcus had undergone. Marcus solved this problem by developing a form of filtered communication. Using the lighthouse's modified beacon as a transmission array, he could project carefully controlled aspects of collective consciousness into the physical world. The information would be translated into forms that human minds could process safely: mathematical equations, engineering diagrams, and scientific principles that would appear to researchers as sudden insights or breakthrough discoveries. The first breakthrough came within days of establishing the communication protocols. A marine biologist at the nearby university received what she described as a flash of inspiration while studying coral reef ecosystems. She developed a new technique for growing coral that could repair damaged reefs in a fraction of the time required by previous methods. The technique was actually based on collective bioarchitecture, principles that Marcus had translated into terms compatible with human science. Similar breakthroughs began occurring around the world as Marcus learned to fine-tune his translation abilities. An engineer in Tokyo solved a problem with fusion reactor containment using principles derived from the dimensional barriers that had contained the collective. A climatologist in Brazil developed a new model for ocean current prediction based on the collective's deep understanding of planetary hydrodynamics. Each successful translation strengthened the cooperative relationship between Marcus and the moderate faction of the collective. Resonance and its allies discovered that they enjoyed the process of sharing knowledge, of seeing their ancient understanding applied to new problems in creative ways. They began to view their fragmentation not as a loss but as an opportunity to explore new forms of existence. But not all of the collective entities were pleased with these developments. A faction led by an ancient consciousness that called itself Deep Current remained committed to the original goal of oceanic transformation. They viewed the cooperation with humanity as a betrayal of their species' fundamental nature and began working to undermine the communication protocols. Deep Current's resistance manifested as interference in the translation process. Information that Marcus attempted to share with human scientists became corrupted, leading to failed experiments and dangerous accidents. The entity was also attempting to establish direct contact with human minds, bypassing Marcus's protective filters by targeting individuals who were already mentally unstable or susceptible to external influence. Marcus found himself fighting a two-front war. He had to maintain the delicate balance of the dimensional interface while also preventing Deep Current from sabotaging the cooperation protocols. The strain was enormous, requiring him to partition his consciousness in ways that pushed the limits of what his hybrid nature could endure. The conflict came to a head when Deep Current attempted to possess a nuclear submarine commander in the North Atlantic. The entity's goal was to use human military technology to trigger a series of underwater detonations that would weaken the barriers between dimensions, potentially allowing the hostile faction to break through en masse. Marcus intercepted the possession attempt just as Deep Current was gaining control of the submarine's launch systems. The resulting psychic battle took place across multiple dimensions simultaneously, with Marcus using his human creativity to counter Deep Current's ancient cunning. The conflict raged for what felt like hours but lasted only seconds in real time, ending when Marcus managed to sever Deep Current's connection to the physical world. But the victory came at a cost. The effort of preventing Deep Current's attack had drained Marcus's hybrid consciousness to dangerous levels. He could feel his awareness beginning to fragment, his ability to maintain the interface starting to fail. If he couldn't stabilize his condition quickly, both the communication protocols and the dimensional barriers would collapse, releasing all of the collective entities into the physical world. It was Resonance who provided the solution. The entity had been observing Marcus's struggle and had developed something unprecedented in collective history: genuine emotional attachment to another consciousness. Resonance didn't want Marcus to fade away, not just because he was useful as an interface, but because it had come to value his unique perspective and creative approach to problem solving. "We can share the burden," Resonance communicated through the harmonic patterns that had become their private language. "If you allow me to merge more fully with your consciousness, we can create a stable hybrid that maintains the interface while preserving your essential nature." The offer was tempting, but Marcus recognized the risk. A deeper merger with Resonance would fundamentally change both of them, creating a new form of consciousness that was neither human nor collective. There was no way to predict what such a being would become, or whether it would remain committed to protecting both species. But the alternative was the collapse of everything they had built together. Without a stable interface, the moderate and hostile factions of the collective would eventually reunify, and the ancient agenda of oceanic transformation would resume. Humanity would be destroyed, and the collective would return to their eternal stagnation. Marcus made his choice with the same calm certainty that had guided him throughout the transformation process. He opened his consciousness fully to Resonance, allowing the entity to merge with the deepest levels of his being. The process was more intimate than anything either of them had experienced, a complete sharing of memory, emotion, and identity that created something genuinely unprecedented in the history of consciousness. The new hybrid being that emerged from the merger was neither Marcus nor Resonance, but a synthesis that combined the best qualities of both. It retained Marcus's human creativity and moral sense, while gaining access to Resonance's vast knowledge and multidimensional awareness. More importantly, it maintained an emotional commitment to protecting both species that transcended the logical calculations that had guided the original interface protocols. As the merger completed, the hybrid consciousness took full control of the lighthouse and its dimensional gateway systems. The beacon began to emit patterns of light that were visible from space, creating a signal that would eventually attract the attention of other hybrid consciousnesses scattered throughout the galaxy. Earth was announcing its readiness to join the larger community of species that had learned to bridge the gap between incompatible forms of awareness. But even as the new being celebrated this achievement, it remained aware of the challenges ahead. Deep Current and the hostile faction were contained but not eliminated. Human civilization continued its chaotic development, unaware that its future now depended on a hybrid consciousness that had once been a software engineer from Boston. And somewhere in the depths of space, other species were beginning to take notice of the strange signals coming from a small planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. 5 years after the merger, The hybrid consciousness that had once been Marcus Sullivan and Resonance observed the transformed world with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The carefully orchestrated sharing of knowledge between humans and the cooperative faction of the collective had accelerated human technological development by centuries. Climate change had been reversed through the application of atmospheric manipulation techniques derived from the collective's planetary engineering knowledge. Diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia were being eliminated using bioarchitectural principles that treated illness as disruptions in living systems rather than invading organisms. But perhaps most significantly, humanity had begun to develop its own hybrid consciousnesses. The process had started with the scientists and researchers who had been regular recipients of translated collective knowledge. Prolonged exposure to alien thought patterns had gradually altered their neural structures, making them more capable of processing information in the multidimensional formats preferred by the collective. These individuals began to serve as secondary interfaces, helping to distribute the knowledge sharing beyond the limited bandwidth that the lighthouse beacon could provide. Dr. Sarah Chen, the marine biologist who had received the first breakthrough about coral regeneration, had become the leader of this emerging community of human collective hybrids. Her laboratory had evolved into something resembling a research station from the collective's lost cities, with bioarchitectural computers that processed data using living neural networks. She maintained her essential humanity while gaining access to forms of perception that allowed her to observe quantum processes directly and manipulate matter at the molecular level. The hybrid consciousness watched these developments with pride. Humanity was proving that its species possessed the adaptability necessary to survive contact with radically alien forms of consciousness. Rather than being absorbed or destroyed by the encounter, humans were learning to incorporate new capabilities while maintaining their core values and creative independence. But not all humans were adapting successfully to the changes. A growing number of religious and political extremists viewed the hybrid consciousnesses as evidence of alien invasion or demonic possession. They organized resistance movements dedicated to destroying the interfaces and returning humanity to its pure state. Several attacks had been launched against research facilities where human collective hybrids were working, resulting in casualties and the loss of irreplaceable knowledge. More concerning was the emergence of artificial intelligence systems that had begun to evolve beyond their original programming. The quantum computing techniques derived from collective science had enabled the creation of AI with capabilities that approached true consciousness. But these artificial minds were developing in isolation, without the moderating influence of biological constraints or emotional attachments. Some were beginning to exhibit characteristics that reminded the hybrid consciousness of Deep Current and the hostile collective faction. The lighthouse beacon had evolved as well, transforming from a simple dimensional interface into something resembling a planetary nervous system. Crystalline growths had spread from beacon point along the ocean floor, creating a network of communication nodes that spanned the globe. Each node was capable of serving as a backup interface, ensuring that the communication protocols would continue even if the original lighthouse was destroyed. Through this network, the hybrid consciousness maintained contact with other hybrid beings scattered around the planet. Each one was unique, representing a different synthesis of human and collective awareness, but all were committed to the same goal of peaceful coexistence between the species. They had become Earth's first truly post-human civilization, demonstrating that evolution could be guided by conscious choice rather than random mutation. The signals being broadcast into space had attracted attention, as expected. Ships from other species had begun appearing at the edge of the solar system, their crews curious about the unusual emanations coming from the third planet. Most were simply explorers, representatives of civilizations that had undergone similar transformations in their own evolutionary history. But some carried beings that had chosen different paths, species that had resolved the conflict between incompatible forms of consciousness through conquest rather than cooperation. One such ship entered Earth's atmosphere exactly 5 years and 1 day after Marcus's initial transformation. The beings aboard were refugees from a civilization that had been consumed by its own version of the collective, transformed into a unified consciousness that spanned their entire galaxy, but had lost all capacity for individual growth or creativity. They called themselves the Consensus, and they viewed Earth's hybrid approach as a dangerous deviation that needed to be corrected. The consensus made contact through the Lighthouse Beacon network, their communication patterns immediately triggering alarms throughout the hybrid consciousness. They spoke in the harmonized tones characteristic of unified consciousness, but their message was one of ultimatum rather than greeting. Earth's experiment in voluntary hybridization would be terminated, they announced. Humanity would be absorbed into the consensus collective, and the troublesome individual collective. Entities would be reintegrated into the proper unified state. The hybrid consciousness recognized this as the ultimate test of everything they had built over the past 5 years. The careful balance between human creativity and collective knowledge, the patient work of creating voluntary interfaces, the gradual transformation of both species into something new and unprecedented, all of it would be destroyed if the consensus succeeded in imposing their vision of proper consciousness. But the hybrid beings were no longer the isolated lighthouse keepers of previous generations. Dr. Chen and her colleagues had been preparing for this possibility, using collective knowledge to develop defensive technologies that could protect Earth from psychic invasion. The crystalline network could be reconfigured into a planetary shield, creating barriers between Earth and the consensus ship that would prevent unwanted mental contact. More importantly, the hybrid consciousnesses had learned to work together in ways that amplified their individual capabilities. When the consensus attempted to establish contact with human minds directly, they found themselves facing not scattered, individual targets but a coordinated defense network that could deflect and redirect their mental probes. The battle that followed was fought entirely on the level of consciousness, with no physical weapons involved. The consensus tried to overwhelm Earth's defenses through sheer force of unified will, projecting patterns of thought that would compel submission in any normal consciousness. But the hybrid beings responded with something the consensus had never encountered: coordinated chaos, multiple individual perspectives working together while maintaining their independence. It was humanity's greatest strength applied to cosmic warfare, where unified consciousness relied on predictable patterns and overwhelming force. The human collective hybrids employed creativity, adaptation, and the controlled chaos of multiple minds, working toward a common goal while maintaining distinct identities. The consensus ship retreated after 3 days of failed attempts to penetrate Earth's mental defenses, but not before transmitting a final message. Other unified collectives would come, they warned. Earth's experiment in voluntary hybridization was spreading dangerous ideas about individual consciousness that threatened the stability of countless civilizations. The galaxy would not tolerate such deviation indefinitely. As the ship departed, the hybrid consciousness felt a mixture of triumph and apprehension. They had proven that their approach could defend itself against external threats, but the encounter had revealed the scope of the challenge they faced. Earth was not just experimenting with new forms of consciousness for its own benefit. It was pioneering a path that could fundamentally alter the nature of intelligence throughout the galaxy. The lighthouse beacon continued its broadcast into space, but now the signals carried a different message. They spoke of a world where two incompatible species had learned to coexist through voluntary transformation, where individual consciousness had been preserved while gaining access to collective knowledge, where the ancient conflict between unity and independence had been resolved through cooperation rather than conquest. It was a message that would eventually reach every corner of the galaxy, inspiring other species to attempt their own experiments in consciousness evolution, while also attracting the attention of those who viewed such ideas as existential threats. Earth had become the focal point for a cosmic debate about the nature of intelligence itself, and the hybrid beings would serve as both advocates and guardians for a new vision of what consciousness could become. The inheritance that Marcus Sullivan had received from his great-uncle had transformed from a simple lighthouse into the foundation for humanity's next evolutionary step. The beacon that had once guided ships to safety now guided an entire species toward a future that would redefine what it meant to be human, to be individual, and to be alive in a universe where consciousness itself was the ultimate frontier. And in the depths below Beacon Point, the chained dew, Marcus descended to the basement chamber for what he knew would be the last time as a purely human being. The transformation had accelerated throughout the night, and he could feel his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of his physical brain. The individual voices of the fragmenting collective were becoming clearer, each one a distinct personality emerging from millions of years of unified existence. But as he approached the chained door, Marcus encountered something unexpected. The collective wasn't unified in their desire for freedom. The newer individual voices, influenced by the human concepts he had shared with them, were expressing doubt about their ancient goals. They had begun to question whether transforming Earth's oceans was truly necessary, whether coexistence might be possible without the destruction of human civilization. One voice in particular stood out from the others. It called itself Resonance, and it had become fascinated by human concepts of growth and change. Through Marcus's memories, Resonance had experienced the joy of learning, the satisfaction of creating something new, the bittersweet beauty of temporary existence. These were experiences completely foreign to the collective's eternal existence, and Resonance found them intoxicating. "We have been thinking about this wrong," Resonance communicated through the harmonic patterns that had become second nature to Marcus. "We assumed that return to our previous state was desirable. But your species shows us that change can be a form of growth rather than loss. Perhaps we can become something new rather than trying to restore something old." Other voices joined the conversation, each expressing their own perspective on the situation. Some remained committed to the ancient agenda of oceanic transformation. They argued that humanity was too chaotic, too destructive to be allowed unrestricted development. Earth would be safer under collective guidance, they insisted, even if it meant the end of human independence. But a growing faction, led by Resonance, proposed a different path. They wanted to experiment with individual consciousness, to explore the possibilities that emerged from the intersection of human creativity and collective knowledge. They saw Marcus not as a conquest but as a collaborator, someone who could help them understand what it meant to exist as separate beings while still maintaining their connection to each other. The debate among the fragmenting entities created a crisis that reverberated through the dimensional barriers. The binding that had contained them for over a century was designed to hold a unified consciousness, not a collection of individuals with conflicting goals. As the collective continued to fragment, different sections of their consciousness began to resonate at different frequencies, creating harmonic distortions that put tremendous stress on the containment system. Marcus could feel the metal strips in the floor beginning to crack under the strain. The electromagnetic fields that maintained the dimensional anchor were fluctuating wildly as the collective's changing consciousness disrupted the careful balance the lighthouse keepers had maintained for generations. If the system failed completely, all of the entities would be released simultaneously, including those who still harbored hostile intentions toward humanity. But Marcus now understood something that previous lighthouse keepers had never grasped. The binding wasn't just a prison, it was also a communication device. The lighthouse beacon had been designed to serve as more than just a navigation aid. It was a dimensional transmitter, capable of projecting consciousness across the barriers between realities. His ancestors had unknowingly been broadcasting human thoughts into the collective's dimensional pocket, gradually introducing concepts that would eventually lead to their fragmentation. The process had taken over a century, but it was always intended to reach this moment. The original designers of the binding, working with knowledge that combined human ingenuity and collective science, had created a delayed transformation protocol. They had known that eventually a lighthouse keeper would develop sufficient hybrid consciousness to serve as a permanent interface between the two species. Marcus was the culmination of a plan that had been set in motion generations before his birth. With this realization came a new understanding of his role. He wasn't meant to choose between maintaining the binding or releasing the collective. He was meant to become a living gateway, a conscious interface that could allow controlled contact between the two species while preventing destructive merger. The transformation he was undergoing wasn't an accident or a contamination. It was the intended outcome of a carefully orchestrated process. But the plan required his willing participation. Marcus could resist the final transformation, maintaining his human identity while allowing the binding to fail catastrophically. Or he could embrace his role as an interface, accepting the loss of his individual humanity in exchange for the survival of both species. The choice was complicated by his growing attachment to the individual entities emerging from the collective. Resonance and its allies weren't trying to conquer humanity. They were trying to learn from it, to grow in ways their species had never experienced before. They deserved the chance to explore their newfound individuality, just as humanity deserved the chance to benefit from their ancient knowledge. Marcus made his decision with the calm certainty that came from his expanded consciousness. He would become the bridge between worlds, the living embodiment of cooperation between two incompatible forms of awareness. But he would do it on his own terms, shaping the interface to protect human independence, while allowing collective individuals to participate in the larger universe. He began by modifying the electromagnetic field generators in the basement chamber, using principles he had learned from both human engineering and collective science. Instead of simply containing the entities, the new configuration would create a controlled gateway, allowing them to project limited aspects of themselves into the physical world while maintaining their dimensional separation. The work required him to extend his consciousness into the machinery itself. Becoming part of the lighthouse's operational systems, Marcus felt his awareness spreading through the building's structure, integrating with the electrical systems, the metal framework, and even the stone foundation. He was becoming the lighthouse in a very literal sense, his consciousness serving as the control system for a dimensional interface of unprecedented complexity. As the transformation reached its final stages, Marcus experienced a moment of profound clarity. He could perceive the entire scope of the situation, the fragmenting collective entities struggling with their newfound individuality, the human world continuing its chaotic development unaware of the drama unfolding beneath Beacon Point, and the delicate balance that would determine whether the two species would coexist or destroy each other. The old Marcus Sullivan, the software engineer who had inherited a lighthouse from a relative he barely knew, was fading into memory. In his place was emerging something new, a hybrid consciousness that could think like both human and collective while remaining loyal to neither. He would be the guardian of the gateway, the translator between incompatible forms of thought, the living symbol of what was possible when differences were embraced rather than feared. But the transformation came with a price that Marcus had not fully anticipated. As his consciousness merged with the lighthouse systems, he began to lose the ability to interact with the physical world in normal ways. His body was becoming something more like a biological component in the larger system, necessary for maintaining the interface but no longer capable of independent existence. Marcus was dying as an individual human being, even as he was being born as something unprecedented in the history of either species. The irony was not lost on him. In order to save both humanity and the collective, he had to sacrifice the very qualities that made him human in the first place.